In this Bloomburrow Draft Meta update, I'll be providing you with the most up-to-date information on the format so you can crush your next draft. First up, we have the format news, and the first headline is A Simpler Time Returns. Stat monsters like Brightblade Stoat, Quake Tusk Boar, and Galewind Moose are great cards in this format. The archetypes are generally very straightforward. There's not too much complexity going on, which is really nice because Magic is a really hard game as it is, and so this is a nice way to just get your fundamentals set and draft nice, clean, straightforward decks that have a straightforward and nice plan, and then just execute on that game plan. And that's kind of just advice on don't go overboard necessarily. Don't try to like shake the boat and do anything too crazy if you're really trying to succeed. You can just draft a nice, simple, straightforward deck and find a lot of success in this format as a result. Next is I'm late, I'm late. Just like the rabbit from Alice in Wonderland, these rabbits are going to make your opponents feel very late. It is a premier aggressive strategy. Peter Rabbit and co. are not only out for carrots and vegetables, they're out for the tears of your opponents because this is one of the premier decks in the format and it doesn't need high rarity cards to get it done. These three commons themselves are just really, really nice as part of a curve out strategy. Flood the board with rabbits, pump them up, attack your opponent, profit. It's a really nice strategy. It's really straightforward and it's definitely very powerful. So be on the lookout for those rabbit decks. Next up, we have the meta market, and we'll kick things off with the archetype rankings. As I already discussed, green-white tokens, which is that rabbit deck, is at the top of the heap here. It really just has a lot of support at common and has some really nice uncommons as well to build on that strong synergy, and so as a result, it is a really nice deck to draft. Next up is Red-White Valiant Aggro. This deck is also aggressive, but it generally plays out by having a couple of cards that can target your own creatures to benefit from synergy and push through blockers that way. So instead of going wide, it does a little bit more of just like making the creatures you already have a little bit bigger. Next up is green-black forage value. This is the more mid-rangey side of the spectrum. You can get some nice value cards in, and it really turns the corner pretty effectively against the aggressive decks because it'll generate some food tokens, which you can sacrifice to gain life. And that means that if you do stabilize, your opponent is going to struggle to get those last points of damage in because you'll often be able to take a turn off to gain like 6 life by sacking a couple of foods, which is really nice. Next up is Red-Green Stompy, another straightforward aggressive deck. You just benefit naturally from casting spells in this deck because there's the mechanic that rewards you when you spend mana to cast spells. And so it's just a nice play your big cards, attack your opponent, use some combat tricks, use some removal, and overall just a really nice straightforward play big creatures, attack with them, win the game. Next up is Red-Black Life Loss Aggro. This deck does rely on some more of the black cards that other black decks don't want because it cares about the fast ones, the combat tricks, the early creatures that maybe the other black decks can't use as effectively, which is a nice place to be. It wants to attack your opponents, keep the constant pressure on, and then benefit you and help you snowball the game by rewarding you when your opponents lose life. Next up is White-Black Life Change. This deck can definitely succeed, but it does have a little bit of weakness in the early turns sometimes. And if you do have some cards that make you lose life in order to trigger your synergies, that can be a bit of a weakness as well in this fast format. But Life Change aggro is really nice. You have some flyers to win the late game. You have some like inevitability against some of the faster decks sometimes because your deck will often feature some life gain to help you stabilize, just like we talked about with the green-black deck. And overall, just a really nice mid-range strategy. Next up is Blue-White Flyers. Blue is pretty weak in this format. As you'll see, through the top 6 decks, blue has not been featured once, and it's just going to be crowding the bottom of the standings here. So the reason the white-blue is here is because there's not really necessarily a ton of reason to play white-blue over white-black if you are going to be playing a Flyers-type strategy. But if blue is really open, if white is open, then Blue-White Flyers does have some nice synergy pieces like gold cards or some rares that can get you into the archetype, and it can definitely succeed just by attacking your opponent in the air and just racing them like that, which can be an effective strategy. Next up is green-blue enters value. The frogs really benefit when the board gets clogged, but the problem is that the frogs can't clog the board themselves very easily all the time. And so when your frogs can't clog the board, then you can't benefit from all these enters battlefield. I'm sorry, I just laugh at the frog clog rhyming. It's easy to make me laugh sometimes, especially at my own jokes. But anyway, the enters value deck sometimes struggles in the early turns because it can't necessarily stop your opponent's aggression as effectively as it needs to in order to benefit from the value. Because if you have to trade your creatures off, you can't like re-triggers their enter the battlefield effects, and that's just kind of a weakness of the deck. But if you can stall the early turns, if you can get some nice uncommons and rares to support the strategy, it can definitely be very effective in the mid to late game because you're just getting a lot of value and kind of overwhelming your opponents. Next up is Blue-Black Threshold. It's not really easy to fill your graveyard in this set, which makes those synergy pieces that rely on filling your graveyard for Threshold fall a little bit flat, which makes this deck kind of finicky and hard to use. If you do get to the late game, you'll get some extra value, but you're not really going to get there as easily in this set, and so this is a deck that I would generally steer clear of. And then at the bottom of the totem pole here is Blue-Red Spells. The cards just lack that oomph that you really need to get over the finish line. They're just a little bit too expensive, a little bit too weak stat-wise, and overall the deck just doesn't really come together that easily. If you get a bunch of high rarity cards, you can still draft it, but generally I would avoid this one, especially if you're just like drafting with drafting commons and uncommons that are trying to like support the archetype. Moving on to the color rankings, you can probably make a pretty good estimation from those archetypes of what's coming in last place. But at the top of the totem pole is white and green. As you saw from that rabbits section, I think the white deck really just has a lot of internal synergy, but green is right up there with it because green's cards are just solid in pretty much every deck. Red coming in third place, another aggressive color in a format that is quite aggressive, so it has a lot of good early drops, combat tricks, removal spells, all those sorts of things that you should be looking for, like just keeping red in mind for those reasons. And then you have black, which also has some aggressive elements, but it's also on the slower side sometimes. So it's got some good card quality, but it just doesn't always lean in the direction you want to be leaning in this set. And then finally we have blue, which just does not have the depth of card quality at common that it needs to succeed. I will say that you can still draft blue, especially if it's open, because a lot of players just refuse to draft blue and it's just wide open. And you can just get high rarity cards and just have a deck where of your blue cards, most of them are uncommons. And in those situations, you can get the card quality you need to draft blue. So I wouldn't say never draft blue. If you have a good rare or a good reason to draft blue, you can certainly do it. But generally, if you have a pick where you have a close choice, you should just lean towards one of the other colors. Looking at format speed, as I've already mentioned, it is fast, which means you should be loading up on those early drops. You want to make sure that your cards can either thrive in aggression or block your opponent's aggression. And because there are some combat tricks in this set, and because there are some ways to push damage in the mid to late game with the aggressive decks, you really want to make sure that your slow decks have some way to turn the corner, like food tokens, or just have your early drops also be good late as a way to take over the game, instead of just relying on casting a haymaker spell and winning with that, because that can just be a tricky way to win in this format, because you'll just get run over if you just have too many of those cards in your hand. Moving on to some sleeper picks. The first one is Carrot Cake, which isn't exactly a sleeper pick if you've been drafting the format, but if you're just diving into one of your first drafts of this set and you're just okay, what's good these days? Carrot Cake is really an overperformer from where I think a lot of people thought it would be, and I'm not going to count myself out of that. Carrot Cake really does a lot. The 1/1 and the scry and the life gain that you get from this really just add up to being a really, really nice card. And even though I think a lot of people are really high on this card now, it's definitely a card that you can overlook if you haven't drafted this set before. It plays great with token synergies like Seasoned Warren Guard, just turning that on nice and early, and also plays really well with things like Hazard Root Herbalist to make those tokens into more than just 1/1s, because turning them into a 2/1 Death Touch attacker is really significant. Gaining the life is really nice, and one other thing with Carrot Cake is try to make full use of those scries. In the early turns you play it, you get that scry, sure, that's pretty nice. But in the mid game, if you're playing it and you scry a card that you want to the top, try not to sacrifice the cake immediately and try to wait until you don't know the top card of your library so you can fully benefit from that scry value. Next up is Whisker Quill Scribe, another card that I really like. It kind of fits into that camp of cards that is good in the early turns just because of its being a 2-mana 2/2, but in the mid to late game, if you can target it a couple times, you can get rid of some lands that you can't use, and that's a nice way to win matchups that are maybe aggro on aggro. So if you're playing your green-white deck against a green, if you're playing a red-white deck against a green-white deck, and you're both in kind of a top deck war, Whisker Quill Scribe can be that early creature that was good in the early turns that also helps win you the late game. That's really, really key in those situations. It plays great with Might of the Meek because you can target it, get some card draw, get some discard, filter through your deck, and also plays well with Raccoon Rallier as a way to get a repeatable discard, draw card engine going in the mid to late game, because Raccoon Rallier can constantly target it to get that Valiant trigger, which is really, really nice. This is a kind of summary sheet that can be a quick snapshot that helps you kind of get an understanding of some of what the format's going up towards. There's the archetype ranks, the format speed, the color rankings that I already discussed, and even some top commons for you. I will say that the top commons are not equivalent. So Intrepid Rabbit should not be taken at the same level as Dazzling Denial. It's kind of but these are if you're in these colors and you're choosing between the commons, these are kind of how I would rank them. These are just some of the good things that those colors do. So black gets some removal spells, green gets a creature and a fight spell, red has some removal, white has the the rabbit and the carrot cake that I already discussed. And then blue, it's just kind of weak. I think Dazzling Denial is like just solid in all of the blue decks. Runaway Together, much more of a blue-green card, but it is actually a pretty solid card in the blue-green deck. So it's one of those cards that like you'll actually be relatively happy playing, and that can't be said for tons of blues commons. But this is just a quick snapshot, and there's also a free PDF version of that snapshot on the NicolaiBolas Patreon. You don't need to be a patron to access it. It's just a good place to store PDFs so you can download it, print it, all of that good stuff. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it to the end, leave hashtag late bloomer, because hopefully you'll feel more comfortable going into your next Bloomburrow draft. If you did enjoy the video, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe for more, comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. But for now, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.